So welcome everyone to our April 2026 Community of Practice COVES webinar. We're very excited you're joining us for our Aggregate Report preview. In full disclosure, we're going to emphasize the word preview. This is a pre-release. This is a teaser. We're still actively working on the content, but we have lots of ideas, plenty to share, and we're really excited to bring you into the process right now as we put the finishing touches on the content of the report with the goal, with the it's not a goal because it's going to happen. A print deadline the few days right before the AAM conference next month, so we can distribute physical copies to folks who are going to be in person in Philadelphia. And as we were talking about before this call started, for those of you who are unable to join in Philadelphia or find us at another conference, we will be sure to mail you a copy of the report so you can have it, sleep with it, frame it on your wall, do all sorts of things. Show it to your neighbor. It's going to be great. Let's go ahead and get started, Allison. So before I do some introductions for at least one special guest on this call, we're going to just really quickly talk about what today's webinar is going to introduce. As you can see here, the focus is on our calendar year 2025 report. So the last few years, we've been doing our best to do 2 reports a year, our quote unquote fiscal year, July to June cycle, and then the January to December calendar year cycle. We're excited this year to call our report a closer look at museum visitors. So in the past, we've just called them Understanding Our Visitors Multi-Institutional Museum Study, but we're trying to have a focus on the visitors themselves. So today we'll talk a little bit about the sample, the data that went into this report. We're going to explore the aggregate data, so the highest level findings across all sites that were included with respect to data quality. And then we're going to dive deep into exploring identity. So how do visitors' experiences differ? This is the focus of this year's report. This is what we're excited to preview with you and get some feedback on. And then we're going to talk briefly about next steps at the end. So a closer look at museum visitors. As I just mentioned, in years past, we have done this very same thing, shared aggregate data and census comparisons. That's kind of the bread and butter of what the COVES system provides. And then through our reporting, we've explored differences between museums or types of visitor groups. I call these visitor attributes, right? Are you a member? Do you live locally? Are you visiting with kids? Things that are less about your identity, but more about the characteristics of your visiting group, right? Either as an individual or as a multi-individual group. This year, however, we're going to still do the aggregate and census comparisons, but the deep dive is with respect to visitor identity and then using those identities to unpack experiences. Specifically, we're going to look at and talk more about race and ethnicity, gender identity, LGBTQ plus identity, disability status, and our socioeconomic variables, education and income level. Go ahead. Great. So this is where I'm going to start with some brief introductions. Hopefully I don't need one. So I'm just going to skip kind of the pleasantries there. And Allison and Mallory are also on the call. They're the COVES team at the Museum of Science in Boston. But I'm particularly excited to introduce you to Katrina Bledsoe, although she regretfully is unable to be on this call today. But she has been really helpful in thinking through everything we've been doing so far. Katrina Bledsoe, PhD, is a trained evaluator and mixed methodologist with evaluation experience in U.S. domestic and international settings. She is a partner with Strategic Learning Partners for Innovation, SLP4I.
Yeah.
Over here.
And her areas of focus include education, both formal and informal learning, contextually and culturally responsive and theory-driven research and evaluation approaches, contexts, and organizational learning. Also with us on the call today, and you can say hi to Cecilia Garibay, who is the president of Garibay Group and specializes in culturally responsive, transformative methodologies. One focus of her work involves the development of equity-focused research and evaluation practices in museums to support organizational change. So everyone give a warm welcome to Cecilia. Woohoo! I'm particularly pleased to be working with Cecilia and Katrina. We have been blessed to have their breadth of wisdom and insight throughout this process. We've been working on this, if you can believe it, for 4 months. We started conversations in December about what we wanted to look at, how we were going to look at the research that we should use to frame our conversations and our data analysis. And we've been really thoughtful and purposeful about touching base and trying to be as, I will say, respectful of the data as possible. I think that's one thing I always try and prioritize is treating the data with respect so that it can do great things for us, but we're not abusing it. So let's see. Before we get into the sample information, Cecilia, I want to give you the opportunity without forcing you to say anything about our process thus far, because I know we were kind of vague about how you might offer some thoughts about our work and our partnership to date.
I'm happy to just do a very quick framing. I would say that in addition to looking at the physical data, it really was about how we approached it as a group. So it's a very collaborative process. We've met, done very much an iterative kind of thinking together. And I would say one of the things is that we really were approaching the data with a lot of curiosity. So it was a lot of what questions do we have? How much might we learn if we do this? And that process of just asking those questions with a lot of curiosity and sort of exploring led us down different paths that I think we wouldn't have otherwise if we hadn't approached it with a very open sort of inquiry kind of approach, rather than saying we're coming in and doing these five things and we'll be done, which also makes it for a longer process. But I think it's been really an interesting process to be able to ask a lot of questions. And the last thing I would say is that the group work has been really instrumental in that because it's in that thinking where someone brings up an idea and that generates some thinking. We do a little exploration. It takes us down a particular path, and then we re-engage. That's been both part of the really fun part of the process, but I think has been integral to the kind of sort of exploration and where we are now and the questions we're able to answer is partly because of that process. So I think sometimes, Ryan, you've referred to it as sort of poking at the data, and I
Mhm.
love that because it really is a little bit about that. The other thing I would just say is that because we're working with existing data that was intended for particular things, we know that there were limitations to that, and that was perfectly fine. I think one of the things that we're learning is what can the data tell us, and then what are the kinds of things that maybe we're curious about that spur more questions for a different study or for a different COVES report, and that can be as important to understand what you know and what might require further exploration, and that's exciting too. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you for that context and the framing, Cecilia. I really appreciate that. And we say that about Coves all the time, right? Coves is bound to give you plenty of data, lots to think about, but it's also almost definitely going to give you additional questions, right? It's not going to answer everything. It's going to bring more to the surface about what you want to learn that's not contained within the parameters of the Cove survey and our community of practice. Also, before we jump slides, their pictures aren't up here, but Sarah Cohn of Aurora Consulting, Gabby Wilson of ASTC, always integral to our ongoing COVES work. And I'm excited because we're bringing them more into the reporting process later this week as well. So don't think you're out of it, Sarah and Gabby. You're still in this too. All right, let's hop right into the sample because then we got to go into the aggregate and then we got to go into our deep dive. So the sample, as you know, is all of your data, right? I take it, smush it, pull it apart. I do all the fun things. Remember that for eligibility in this report, there were several criteria for data quality, specifically at least 100 surveys collected over the reporting period, and less than 33% of the entire institutional sample should come from the QR code based on our standardized approach to data collection. There's an asterisk by that 100 because this is, what do I call it? Like a translated sample. Essentially, we have a lot of museums that join throughout the year. They didn't start participating in January of 2025. But if you did a really good job with data collection beginning in July or October or whenever it was that you started, if that would have translated into an adequate sample of at least 100 surveys over the course of a 12-month period, you would be included. And I'm able to account for this with statistical weighting, which I'm going to show you on the next slide. But before I get there, It's important to note that the sample size for this report includes 99 museums, which is amazing. This is the largest the COVES cohort has ever been. As you can see, 46,761 visitor surveys. And as I'm going to show you on the next slide, that translated to a weighted sample of just under 29,000 responses that we're looking at with respect to visitor identities in the aggregate data in this year's cycle. In the context for visitor completion, you can see here that the survey on average took 5 minutes and 7 seconds. There is quite a big span based on the institution and a number of different characteristics, but this still is our, quote unquote 5-minute survey, plus or minus. So that's very important to call out. The next slide is going to show you some of the differences in those sample sizes that I talked about based on statistical weighting. So what's not included here are the 40 or so sites that did not meet the minimum criteria for inclusion in this year's report. This is all of the valid data that we are analyzing. We'll be showing in the next couple slides. The blue bars are the unweighted responses. So you can see that, it goes from very close to zero on the left-hand side and very, very large sample sizes upwards of 1,800 on the right-hand side. The orange bars are the weighted samples. So every single sample is weighted down. But importantly, if you're new to this process and this is your first COVES reporting webinar, you'll notice that the bars on the left, the difference between the blue and the orange is very small. On the right, the difference between the blue and the orange is very large, and this is intentional. So what we're doing is we're preventing exceptionally large sample sizes from predominantly large organizations from dominating the analyses, right? We're trying to make the data spread across all of the sites, the 99 sites that are included, without overrepresenting 1 or 2 or 3 large sample sites. So this takes into a whole bunch of factors, including the percent of your annual target that was hit, the number of months you participated, the size of your organization, and the total sample you contributed towards the aggregate data. And if you have nerdy questions about that, I'm always happy to talk about it, but this is just one way that we help ensure data quality in our aggregate reporting. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Allison for a quick run through of the aggregate data.
Emphasis on quick run through of the aggregate data, recognizing we don't have a lot of time and you will have this in your hands at some point to look over and ponder a little more deeply. So as a reminder, we have group demographics and individual demographics. So group is asking the respondent to talk about everyone in their group. And we see that typically about 2 adults, 2.18 adults and 0.04 children on average are in our groups, though noting that this is one of the places that differs for Science Plus and Art Sites. Science Plus tends to have more children in their groups. So rather than that average of 0.64 children, have 1.4 children on average. And typically about half those groups have 1 or 2 children. So if we look at the group composition on the right, generally, it is 2 adults with 52% or 1 adult at 27%. Many across the whole aggregate, about 2/3 of the sample doesn't have children in their group. So we're looking at those, a lot of adult-only groups there, unless you look specifically at those Science Plus sites. We see that the breakdown for adult ages tends to skew younger and higher. So people in that younger age range, 18 to 24, 24 to 34, 35 to 44, and the 65 plus for adults, and more women than men reporting. For children, this is most of the children are in that 4 to 7 or 8 to 12 range, and pretty evenly split between boys and girls. I think we always wonder a little bit how much of it's are more women at museums versus are more women saying yes to us on the survey. This is another place where there's a little bit more of a difference between art and Science Plus, where especially with those children ages, you tend to see a more even spread of ages across art museums, and the Science Plus skew younger. And similarly with the adult ages, we see more adults who are in that parent of young children age range for Science Plus and older adults at art museums.
I'll just jump in real quick, go back this one slide. And although it's very obvious for the child age and gender, the adult age and gender does include all group members that were reported, not just the person filling out the survey or the respondent. So this is inclusive of everyone in the group.
Yes. For group, we tend to see a lot more locals only. About half of visitors are local only or are mixed, and 20%, 21% are mixed groups. So that a lot of people coming from your local areas, and asking whether or not anyone in the group has a permanent or temporary disability. That's about 11%. Looking at those individual demographics, we have, as Ryan mentioned, some of those characteristics that are more about their behavior. So members, about 15% of members complete the survey. Almost all of our participants are US residents, with 97%, some rounding that makes that look like it doesn't add to 100. And then for respondents, so just the respondent, not anyone else in their group, 15% identify as part of the LGBTQ plus community, with a small percentage saying not sure or prefer not to say. Looking at other individual demographics, we see that as with previous years, our visitors tend to skew to more educated, with 21% having less than a college degree. So this might be part of a degree or not having started college at all. We see that income tends to skew towards the higher end, and we still have a pretty large percentage of white visitors with 60% across the aggregate. But if we think about breaking that down into the science and art and census of where are we representing our communities versus not, with the caveat of this is the national census and is not a perfect one-to-one comparison. It's not feasible to take every single member city and try to figure out what their census is, which is a good thing for you to poke in your own data. But looking across the aggregate, we see that at the top, COVES data underrepresents lower income and overrepresents higher income at the bottom. When you compare it to census, so in those teal bars is the Science Plus cohort, and in the purple bars are the art cohort. For race and ethnicity, similarly, we're seeing over and underrepresentation in different areas, and sometimes bigger differences. I do want to note that we have added Middle Eastern and North African, but have recoded it into preferred to self-described to match census data, because that is not yet on national census. Yeah, so I think this is really interesting, but also something good to dig into in your own data as well, as I'm doing the speedrun version. So this kind of collapses that and focuses on some of the other demographics, where education, we can see much more starkly the difference of how many people in the US have less than a college degree versus how many people who respond to our surveys and are visiting our museums have less than a college degree. So that difference between 55% of Americans versus 21 or 23% of visitors have less than a college degree. And at the opposite end of that, you can see that college degree, we have more in our sample, and a graduate degree is more than double what the national census is. Disability, we are close to, but have more people who identify with a disability coming to museums. And then for folks who identify as LGBTQ plus, science is not too far from census, but really interestingly, art museums are more than double what we see across the national census. why they visit. So this is that motivation question. We see the same sort of spread that we see most years, that visitors are still coming for the same reasons. This is the place where the science plus an art question is a little bit different. So in science, we see spending time together as a group or family, or fun or entertainment for group members, which nicely rolls up into that social enjoyment that we see on the right with the art motivation. So people are typically coming to spend time together, as a group or as individuals. For their visit history, we see that stay time, typically visitors are in that 1 to 2 hour range, with 39% of visitors with a median stay time of 1 hour 38 minutes. This is another place where there's some big differences between science plus and art, where science visitors to science museums tend to stay much longer. So their median visit time or medium stay time is 2 hours 19 minutes, whereas art museums is 1 hour 19 minutes. And that's very much shaped by the type of museums that participate, I think, or I think that is influencing that median. For repeat visitation, most visitors are coming back, with 42%. This is their first visit, and the rest having 2 or 3 to 5 visits. And that gets spread out of how long it's been since they've had their last visit. And then getting into how they feel. So really focusing on the overall experience rating as well as the net promoter score for today. So across the aggregate, we see that 51% say their experience was outstanding, 40% say excellent, and 9 are clumped down in poor, fair, or good. The net promoter score for this time period was 74.6. Where you can see that 79% of visitors rated it an 8 or not an 8, a 9 or a 10 on how likely are you to recommend. So one of the things that we really, as Ryan was saying, that we were interested in looking in is how visitors' experiences might differ based on their identity. And so we looked at this in those 5 areas of race or ethnicity, gender identity, LGBTQ plus identity, disability status, and education and income levels. These were informed by those conversations we had early on with Cecilia and Katrina and our team. I see Ryan's come off mute. I don't know if you want to add some context to this.
Yeah, but I was going to let you finish.
Oh. And so thinking about who are we looking at? Why are we looking at these identities? How do they differ? What reasons might we have for some of these differences? So as we start going through this section, I want to prompt you to think about, if you went and looked at your own data, are these patterns similar? And then one of the really sticky points is how every museum thinks about engagement or representation or inclusion and belonging, and what programs are available or not available might influence how visitors feel. We're looking at this across all of the sites, and that maybe flattens some of the differences. And I think that'd be a really interesting thing to poke at individual sites of, are the differences the same? Are they bigger? Are they smaller? Those are the questions I have. Ryan, context.
Yep, and I was just going to add 2 quick things. One, this is overly simplistic. Identity is very complicated. Identities are often fluid. Identities are intersectional. I am personally learning a lot about this in the process, but I'm also a quantitative data analyst by trade. So my approach is to look at what the data are telling me, even though it is grossly oversimplifying who people are when they come into our museum. But it is a proxy for identity, right? So we recognize this at the beginning. Cecilia kind of alluded to this. We have access to the data. We don't have access to the individuals themselves, but we're still trying to learn. And the second thing I want to mention is just that kind of in between Allison's presentation of the aggregate data and then these deep dives was the comparison to census. All of the lenses that we applied, all the variables, are the ones that are represented in some census data profile somewhere. So when we think about how we're making comparisons between groups, we're literally talking about representation. Which groups are under or overrepresented in our museum visitor data compared to what we know about the US Census? And so that was one way that we framed looking at variables, for example, socioeconomic status, and thinking about what it means to be low income or low education or higher income, higher education. We looked at the census information, we looked at the representation in our data to make some decisions. And so that's how we chose to explore identity and look at differences based on these descriptives. And so with that, I think we're going to turn it over to Mallory to jump right in.
I think
Oh, nope.
I will finish this section and then turn it
Sorry.
over. So thinking about at that most basic a comparison of what was your experience like, we looked at how do net promoter scores differ and how does that overall experience rating differ, recognizing those say slightly different things, but very related things about someone's experience. So looking at race and ethnicity, we are highlighting Hispanic and Latino EX communities, Asian or Asian American, Black or African American, or multiple categories selected. So this is if they only selected Asian or Asian American, they're in that bucket. We are not visualizing Middle Eastern or North African, Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, or American Indian or Alaska Native, because these percentages are so tiny as part of our overall sample that we're not focusing on them right now. So when we look across these groups, we see that our Hispanic community has the highest Net Promoter Score. The biggest differences seem to be in this Net Promoter Score, with the Asian American community rating that lowest. But there are smaller differences in that overall experience rating. So ranging from 51% outstanding with the Hispanic folks to 55% outstanding with Black and African American folks. So we're seeing small differences in general, noting that Asian American folks rate everything a little bit lower. And I think that's interesting, and I'm very curious as to why. Are we offering a different experience? Are there different cultural perspectives on answering surveys? I don't know. Looking at LGBTQ plus folks, we see that people who identify as being part of the LGBTQ plus community have a slightly lower Net Promoter Score, 75.6 as opposed to 76.3. However, they have a slightly higher outstanding percentage on the OER as compared to 51% if they do not identify. For folks with someone in their group has a disability, so this may be the respondent or maybe someone they're visiting with, partially under the assumption of if you are visiting with someone in your group that has a disability, you are likely part of their experience as well. Similarly, the Net Promoter Score is slightly lower, 75.8 as compared to 76, but with a slightly higher overall experience rating, again, 55 and 51%. For income, we're seeing this very similar pattern emerging with how people are experiencing the museums, with a half a point difference between groups. We split this between folks who make under 75,000 a year, or folks who make over 75,000 a year as our cutoff. And I'm pretty sure that was census informed as well.
It's not the exact median household income in the US, but it is close.
It's close, and
It's our closest bucket.
our closest bucket that we could split and have that make sense. And then lastly, very quickly, folks that have less than a college degree have a higher net promoter score and a higher percent outstanding, net promoter score of 78.5 versus folks with a college degree or higher, recommending at a rate of 76.9. And similarly, outstanding hovers in that 55% or 51%. So again, this is very simple. We're looking at these very fast, but some of these patterns, I think, lead to some other overlapping explorations we did. And now we will pass it to Mallory.
Hello, I'm Mallory. In doing this report, we were hoping to not only provide just sort of a not bland, but just sort of a basic, here's the numbers, but also to suggest some opportunities for you to think more deeply about the way that some of these identities intersect. So moving forward in the slide. Awesome. One thing that stood out to us, these are just going to be a handful of examples pulling from LGBTQ plus identification as well as from identifying as having a disability. These are not going to be exhaustive of what we're including in the report, but they're examples of the kinds of things that we will hopefully be able to find in the report in how we are thinking deeper about visitor identity. So one thing that sort of jumped out at our team as we were looking over the data was this trend with LGBTQ plus identity and age, where as you can see, LGBTQ plus identity is here in the blue bars and is much more common in younger generations than it is in older generations. Older generations tend to have a higher representation of non-LGBTQ plus identifying individuals, while younger generations have a higher representation of LGBTQ plus identifying individuals. So as we begin to think about this trend, we might be thinking of what some potential explanations are for this phenomenon. So amongst our team, we came up with two possible explanations that we were thinking of. The first one being that as times change, younger generations may be more accepting of and willing to identify with LGBTQ plus identities than prior generations. This is something that is supported by research and by historical progress here in the US over the past 15 years. A second explanation that might be a little less obvious is that because of the AIDS crisis, many LGBTQ plus people who would currently be in those older age brackets died and did not get to enter those old age periods that would now be represented. So likely it's true that a combination of these and many other factors are affecting who we're seeing in museums and who we're seeing in the world at large. It's worth noting that this trend with LGBTQ plus identity and age is not unique to museums. We are seeing it in our data, but it is something that we see on a national scale as well. And then we also wanted to look at intersections between different marginalized identities that we were talking about here in our current report. So in addition to age, we also looked at LGBTQ plus identity and disability and noticed that LGBTQ plus people were more likely to identify as having a disability, as you can see by quite a lot. This is another trend that exists in our museum data and also exists in national statistics. And so when we were brainstorming possible explanations for this phenomenon, the one that really sort of stands out and that is supported most robustly by the research is the idea of the minority stress effect. So LGBTQ plus people are more likely to experience discrimination, which is a stress-inducing thing. And having that higher level of stress can contribute to higher levels of chronic illness and disability. Stress is a health risk factor. This is a well-established fact. There are possibly other explanations. Maybe people who are already finding themselves outside of a norm in terms of their LGBTQ plus identity are also more readily able to identify themselves outside of a physical, able-bodied norm. I suggest that you think to yourself what reasons might be for this in your community, where your museum visitors are coming from, as well as on a national scale, and brainstorm. And even if you can't think of anything, if you're not used to trying to think of answers to complicated questions like this, what kinds of questions you might ask when doing research on your own to try to answer these questions. One last note is that when we look at all three of these things together, the difference in LGBTQ plus and non-LGBTQ plus individuals with a disability lessens with increasing age. So as people get older, that gap sort of closes, and the rate at which LGBTQ plus people and non-LGBTQ plus people identify as having a disability becomes more similar. Older people tend to be disabled because aging comes with a lot of health related conditions. And so this is something that is sort of natural as a part of that aging process. But this is another thing worth noting and is another way that we are thinking about the intersections of all kinds of different elements of visitor identity for this report. So as we are talking about things like this, these are really complicated issues. But one of our goals in this report is to prompt conversation at your institutions about how these trends do or do not hold up in your own data and what that might mean about your local communities. So maybe your communities have very strong LGBTQ plus community centers. Maybe they are in areas that are less LGBTQ plus friendly on a sort of political scale. And how that might be affecting the numbers that you're seeing in your institution for these types of trends. You also might be worth considering whether there are any special considerations we might make for these visitors to make them feel more welcome based upon the data that we're seeing here in the COVES report. And I believe I'll pass it off
I think it's back to me.
to
Unless
you.
Ryan
Okay, great.
has
I
any
did not
final
remember.
thoughts that he wants to share. So thinking about this approach in your data, there's a little bit of a two-part series of our call next month where we really want to encourage you to look at data in a similar way, think about data in a similar way, and bring some of your thoughts and questions to that call for discussion. So maybe it's picking the experiences for 1 to 3 identities, thinking about maybe, to Mallory's point, community or local context that might influence things, or programs or initiatives that you're having at your institution where I know that we have had a focus at our institution about Heritage Days and representation of different identities in those Heritage Days. So I would hope that that's reflected in our COVES data as well. And as you are looking at your own data, think about what conversations are your institutions having about inclusion or belonging and how that might affect who's visiting. What do you think is driving similarities or differences? And what other data do we need to understand what's happening? Going back to the very beginning, thinking about what COVES can do and what COVES can't do, we can't represent people's complex identities. We can't fully capture those experiences in those complex identities. And this makes me very curious to go talk to people in a deeper way as a way to supplement COVES. And I don't know how we'd fund that, but I'm really interested in doing it. So thinking about what other data might you pull together with COVES to have that broader picture of who your visitors are. Ryan, if you want to add anything to that before I have one call and then we can open to discussion.
I still, I don't have any much to add other than like the data are still very interesting, right? So Cecilia's word earlier was curiosity. I'm still very curious about a lot of things. And I see a couple questions coming up in the chat, which are really good. Curious minds asking questions of our data. There's a lot to explore here. So I'm excited for the remaining work we have to do on the report and excited to share it all with you in about a month.
And before we go to questions, I'm going to ask y'all to share some pictures. We've shared this in the past. We have a handful of museums that have contributed pictures. We would love to highlight more museums that are part of the COVES community in our reports and the presentation where you've seen all these lovely pictures on the side come from our COVES members. So if you have marketing images that you're willing and able to share with us, we would love to use them for the annual reports. We would love to use them for presentations like this. I have a document in this Drive folder that talks about the ways we will and will not use them. We will always credit or cite institution and photographer if you give us that information. But with that, let's go to questions and discussion. I have not been reading the chat, so I don't know if Ryan or Mallory, if you want to start.
Great question from Betsy, which is when do you need the photos by, Allison?
That is a great question. To include in this report, I would say end of April. To include in the future, whenever you can get it to us.
This is a year-round open call.
Yes, year-round open call, but to make it for our design deadline by the end of the month for this particular report.
And you see the note that we should follow up with an email making
Yes.
this request and linking the Google Doc. So this is probably a lot to take in. I'm going to put a couple people on the spot since their brains have already been working on this. Sarah, Cecilia, Gabby, I don't see. Oh, there's Gabby. You know, you've been chewing on this too, and we covered a very slim slice at the top. Any thoughts or reflections about what you're most excited for in next steps? All of it. Me too.
I'm happy to jump in, but I was waiting for Sarah or someone. What I'm excited most is going back, and we've been thinking a lot about how we look at this intersection of different variables here, right? So like what you saw today with a bit of a dive into the LGBTQ plus sort of data and how we intersect that. I think that'll give us a little bit of windows into some possibilities for what we can say with a lot more questions. But I think those questions can be really generative. For example, I'm just seeing in the chat a lot of things about the current context and sort of social and political situation and how that uh, may be affecting the way people identify or want to self-describe. I don't think that's probably a question for these data because of when they were collected, but it is a really interesting thing to think about even as we look forward, what those trends might be. It also makes me wonder about for COVES in the future, things like questions for motivation. You know, one of the things is they're in buckets because they need to be for in order to collect data in this way. But it also opens up questions about are there motivations or areas of experience that we haven't actually typically thought about in these buckets that might be showing up. I was particularly interested in the sort of net promoter score that Allison highlighted and some of those differences. You know, I'm not sure that we can actually with this particular report answer the why to that, but it does surface some interesting differences to consider and explore further.
I really appreciate you all pulling this together and walking through part of it with the 60 of us on this call, the 60 others of us on this call. And, you know, I am thinking a lot about there's so much information here. And you all, you know, Allison, you were like speed data-ing, not even speed dating. I didn't get to talk, you know, speed to data-ing us and knowing there's just so much more. And so I'm thinking a lot about like as we move forward and all of the things that are possible within this, you know, broader community of 99 plus 40, 30 that didn't get to be part of it. Like, how do we continue looking at all of that doesn't get included in the report? How do we continue having these conversations and digging in? And so I really love the fact that we ended with you know, to prepare for next month and to sort of dig in a little bit together. I'll be interested to see what's possible for us collectively around all of that, and also what other questions come up as we all start making sense of this. You know, whatever slice of it that we do get to share in the actual report. what other things come up for us as a full collaborative.
This is always the hardest part of the call for me, to like leave space for thoughts and questions without making too much silence and encouraging people to leave early. But I do want to invite you to come off of mute if you would like to raise a question or a response or reflection. There are a number of great comments in the chat that if you don't have it pulled up, please do. Questions that I can't answer, certainly. So please take a look there.
I'll jump out there. This is Marcus from the Smart Museum of Art, University of Chicago. Uh, I was looking through my report, and we just opened up an exhibition on March 24th, and I don't like how many surveys that we've collected. So I'd be interested to know what has worked for you all in regards to encouraging team members to request surveys from visitors.
That is a great question, Marcus, and we've done a lot of good conversations around that. I'm not sure we have time to cover it in this call, but I saw that Karen offered to connect offline. For those of you who are newer to the community of practice, as with this call, don't forget that we record a lot of them and post them to our YouTube channel. So you can browse previous calls, and we've done a number on data collection strategies and things like that. So we can resurface some of those, and we can also bring it back to the community for more conversations this year.
I just dropped the link to our COVES channel in the chat.
Thank you.
Please go check it out. I think there are a lot of strategies, and so that has been entire COP calls. But also sharing data back, or like getting data collectors involved in the data, because we were talking about data and sharing and reporting. It makes it feel like it's not just going into the void, and it's getting used and getting seen. So that can be one place to start. I'm trying to see if I can quickly find one of the calls that was very specific about data collection strategies.
I think there are big differences between small and large museums in this area. And Marcus, I'm happy to tell you, one of the things we do is when it looks like it's bad, we'll give a few people front desk workers some extra hours just to motivate and say, come and do this. It's not very expensive to do just a couple extra hours, but I mean, I can tell you all the other things we did, but that's the one that's actually the most effective, to tell you the truth.
Summer, thank you so much for raising your hand. Come on in.
Hi, I just thought I would do a quick comment. Ryan mentioned in the chat that some of us in the Twin Cities have been kind of doing some of the similar, looking at different demographics and how that affects the data and stuff like that. And I have kind of a fun data surprise story that's short. At the Bell Museum, we kind of assumed that during Operation Metro Surge that our response rate would go down of people wanting to take a survey because they wouldn't want to give out some of that personal demographic information. And as we dug into the data, we actually found out that our response rate had gone up. And we were like, what? This is weird. So then we did some more digging with other data, like with visitor services and their just attendance numbers. And so then we saw, okay, well, our attendance has drastically dropped during this time of Operation Metro Surge. So then the inference that I made is that fewer people are coming, but the people who are willing to come to a museum are also willing to take a survey. So I don't know, just a fun, what you think you might find might not be what you find, but it's kind of fun to take the time to kind of cross-reference some of these demographics and see what you find.
Thanks for sharing that. That's a really good insight, and it goes back to the utility of having data consistent data over time so that we can detect trends in our audience, right? Like it was less about the non-response factor, but more about who is actually showing up, who feels comfortable in our spaces right now. But there's clearly more work to be done there for all of us. Okay, well, with that said, because we're closing in on the top of the hour and I respect all of your time so much, we're going to wrap this one up. But I want to, for those of you still on the call, Allison used the word homework, right? We posed a couple questions for you. We would love for you to take a look at your dashboard or grab your data file and start thinking about some of these aspects of visitor identity and how they might play out at your institution with respect to experiences. Obviously, we don't want you to do everything, but if there's a question that's really resonating with you or one of these lenses that you and your colleagues have talked about a lot, try and take a look at that before the call in May, and we're going to send an invitation out for that and give a little more detail. But we'd love for you to come with some thoughts in mind to start a conversation around how this report can inform your practice, your data, your use of COVES at your organization. Okay, and with that, thank you all so much for being here. It's always good to see you. We're excited to wrap up this report and put it in your hands soon. I hope you have a wonderful spring day in April, and we'll see you soon. Thanks all.